At first glance, Victoria Hayes had the kind of life people in Atlanta envied. Her house sat behind an iron gate on a quiet, tree-lined street where the lawns were perfectly trimmed and expensive cars rested beneath driveways. Inside, everything looked deliberate. Polished floors, imported furniture, framed photographs from charity galas, and a kitchen that seemed untouched except when guests came over. Victoria knew how to maintain that illusion. She knew which dress to wear, which smile to offer, and how long to hold someone's gaze when they asked about her marriage. "Richard has been wonderful to me," she would say. For years, she had said it without hesitation. Lately, she had begun saying it like a line she had memorized. Richard Hayes was successful, respected, and private, and impossible to read. He had built his fortune through commercial real estate and investments, and people often described him as disciplined, private, and impossible to read. Victoria had once found those qualities attractive. His confidence had made her feel safe, but safety had slowly turned into distance. They still attended dinners together. They still appeared in photographs with their arms around each other. Richard still kissed her cheek when someone was watching. When nobody was watching, there was often silence. At breakfast, he read financial reports while Victoria stared at her coffee. At night, he answered emails from his study long after she had gone upstairs. Conversations that once lasted hours had become brief exchanges about appointments, travel, and household expenses. And recently, Richard had started leaving the house without explaining where he was going. He would dress in a dark suit, take his leather briefcase and say, "I have a meeting." With whom? Business. That word had become a locked door. Victoria noticed everything. She noticed that Richard had stopped leaving documents on the dining table. She noticed that his laptop was almost always beside him. She noticed new passwords appearing on accounts they had once shared. Most disturbing of all, she noticed that whenever she asked about money, Richard's expression changed. Not anger, calculation. One Thursday evening, Victoria waited in the living room while rain tapped against the windows. Richard came home nearly 3 hours later than expected. "You didn't call," she said. "I was busy." "You've been busy a lot lately." Richard removed his coat and looked at her. "Is there something you want to ask me?" The question unsettled her. Victoria forced a smile. "No." "Then don't." He walked upstairs. She remained on the sofa, listening to his footsteps. That night, Victoria barely slept. A thought she had tried to dismiss for weeks finally took shape. What if Richard was preparing to leave her? The possibility frightened her. Not because she was certain she still loved him, but because she had built her entire adult life around the security his wealth provided. Without Richard, she would lose the house, the social circle, the vacations, the effortless life she had grown accustomed to. And if he divorced her before she understood what he was planning, what would remain? The next morning, Richard left early. Victoria watched his car disappear through the gates. Then she went upstairs. She stood outside his study for several seconds before turning the handle. The door opened. His desk was unusually clean. No papers, no files, nothing except a lamp, a laptop, and a silver pen. Victoria walked toward the desk. Then she noticed something on a lower shelf. A thick folder. It was unfamiliar. She pulled it out and saw Richard's name written across the front in black ink. Her fingers tightened around the edge. For a moment, she considered opening it. Instead, she simply stared. Whatever was inside had been hidden from her deliberately. And suddenly, Victoria was afraid that the folder contained the answer to the question she had been too frightened to ask. What exactly was Richard planning to do with her life and his money? The folder remained unopened for 3 days. Victoria carried the image of it everywhere she went. She saw it when she stood before her bathroom mirror, when she sat across from Richard at breakfast, and even when she smiled beside him at a charity dinner. It had become more than a folder. In her mind, it was proof that something had changed. On the 4th morning, curiosity finally defeated restraint. Richard had left before sunrise for another meeting. Victoria waited until his car disappeared beyond the gates, then returned to the study. She closed the door behind her and opened the folder. The first pages were property records, then investment statements, then documents concerning trusts, holding companies, and accounts bearing names she had never seen before. Victoria read each page slowly. The wealth she thought she understood was only. Richard owned properties across Georgia, had investments managed through separate companies, and had placed portions of his fortune into arrangements that appeared designed to protect them from outside claims, including hers. She turned another page and found an account she had never known existed. Another showed a trust. Another contained language concerning beneficiaries. Victoria stopped reading. She closed the folder and returned it to the shelf. But the damage was already done. The discovery changed the way she looked at him. That evening, when Richard walked into the house, Victoria watched him differently. His expensive watch no longer represented success. It represented something he had kept from her. His quiet confidence no longer looked reassuring. It looked calculating. She remembered the years she had spent beside him. The parties she attended because his clients expected her there. The vacations she took when he wanted her smiling beside him. The opportunities she had abandoned because Richard said his career required sacrifices. At the time, she had called those sacrifices love. Now they felt like investments, and she believed she was entitled to the return. The thought frightened her at first. Then it comforted her. If the marriage ended, shouldn't she receive something for everything she had given? Richard noticed the change. One night, while they were eating dinner, he placed his fork beside his plate. "You've been asking questions about my finances." Victoria looked up. "I've been your wife for years. Am I not allowed to know?" "You're allowed to ask. That doesn't mean I have to answer everything." Her face hardened. "Everything?" "Richard, I'm asking about our life." "No," he said quietly. "You're asking about my money." Silence filled the room. Victoria pushed her chair back. "You think I'm obsessed with money?" "I think money has changed you." She stared at him. "That is unbelievably cruel." "Maybe," Richard replied, "but it's true." Victoria denied it immediately. She told him she wanted security, not control. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When the argument ended, he walked away. Victoria remained alone at the table. The house was silent again. She looked toward the staircase, imagining Richard upstairs, surrounded by documents she could not see and decisions she could not control. Then a darker thought entered her mind. What if Richard simply disappeared? The thought lasted only seconds, but Victoria did not reject it as quickly as she should have. Instead, she sat motionless, wondering how different her life might become if the man standing between her and everything she wanted were suddenly gone. And somewhere inside that silence, resentment began turning into something far more dangerous. The thought that had frightened Victoria the night before did not disappear with sleep. It followed her into the morning. She tried to dismiss it as anger, the ugly kind of thought people sometimes have during a failing marriage. But when she saw Richard sitting alone at the breakfast table, reading his newspaper as if nothing had happened, she felt something inside her harden. Then the doorbell rang. Richard looked toward the hallway. "I'm expecting someone." Victoria watched him stand. A few seconds later, a man entered carrying a dark leather briefcase. He was in his early 50s, carefully dressed, with silver beginning at his temples. Richard greeted him with unusual warmth. "Daniel." "Richard." Victoria remained seated. Richard introduced him as Daniel Brooks, his attorney. The name meant nothing to her. Daniel offered a polite smile, but his eyes briefly studied the room before returning to Richard. "We should talk privately," he said. Victoria noticed that immediately. Richard nodded. They disappeared into the study. She waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Victoria stared at the closed door. An attorney. Private meeting. Financial documents. Suddenly, the pieces seemed to fit together. Richard wasn't simply protecting his money. He was preparing for divorce. The possibility made her stomach tighten. She stood and walked toward the hallway, stopping before the study door. She could hear their voices through the wood, but the words were indistinct. She stepped closer. Daniel spoke first. "Richard, I need you to understand that this isn't a simple adjustment. You're changing several things at once. I know. There could be consequences. There are always consequences." Daniel lowered his voice. "Your family may challenge the arrangements. Victoria could challenge them too, depending on how this is structured." Victoria froze. Her name had been spoken. She leaned closer. Richard answered quietly. "That's why I hired you." Daniel sighed. "You've thought about this carefully?" "For months." "And you're certain?" Richard paused. "Yes." Victoria's heart began beating faster. She imagined herself standing in a courtroom while strangers discussed her marriage, her money, and her future. She imagined Richard telling everyone that she had no claim to anything. The humiliation was almost unbearable. Inside the study, papers shifted. Daniel said, "Once these documents are finalized, there will be very little room for interpretation. That is what I want. And if something happens before everyone understands the changes?" Richard's voice became strangely calm. "Then the documents will explain everything." Victoria stepped back from the door. She knew she should leave. Instead, she remained frozen in the hallway. Daniel continued speaking, but she could no longer make out every word. She heard fragments. Beneficiary, protection, family, trust. Then Richard spoke clearly enough for her to hear. "If anything happens to me, make sure the new documents speak for themselves." Victoria's breath caught. She moved quickly away from the door and returned to the kitchen. When Daniel emerged several minutes later, she was standing beside the counter with a cup of coffee in her hand. He looked at her. For one uncomfortable second, neither spoke. Then Daniel smiled politely. "Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Brooks." He nodded and followed Richard toward the front door. Victoria watched them leave. The moment the door closed, her expression changed. She no longer wondered whether Richard was planning something. Now she believed she knew. He was preparing to take everything away from her. For the first time, Daniel's presence disturbed her more than Richard's secrecy. An attorney meant plans and decisions being made without her. She returned to the study after they left, but the folder was no longer where she remembered it. Richard had moved it. That discovery felt like a warning. Victoria stood in silence, listening to the house around her, and felt something begin to shift inside. And if that was true, Victoria realized, she could no longer afford to wait passively for him to make the first move. The thought that Victoria could no longer afford to wait became the thought that followed her everywhere. For several nights, she barely slept. She would lie beside Richard in the darkness, listening to his breathing and wondering whether he was already planning the moment when he would tell her their marriage was over. Sometimes she imagined herself alone in the house, surrounded by furniture she could no longer afford. Other times she imagined Richard standing in court, calmly explaining that she had no right to his wealth. The images became unbearable. She stopped asking what was right and began asking what was necessary. That was how the idea entered her mind. Not as a sudden impulse, as a solution. Victoria hated herself for thinking it. Then she hated Richard for making her think it. Eventually, she stopped hating herself at all. She began telling herself that Richard had created this situation. He had hidden money. He had brought lawyers into their home. He had made decisions about her future without her consent. In her mind, murder slowly became something she had been forced toward. She became secretive. She watched Richard's routines. She noticed what he consumed regularly and waited for an opportunity when he would be unlikely to question anything placed before him. She searched for a way to make his death appear like an ordinary medical tragedy. But she kept the details deliberately vague even in her own thoughts. What mattered to her was not the method. What mattered was the outcome. One rainy evening, Victoria finally crossed the line she had spent weeks approaching. She introduced the poison into something Richard regularly consumed. Her hands trembled afterward. For several seconds, she simply stared at what she had done. She could still stop. She could call for help. She could confess. Instead, she cleaned the evidence of her panic from her face and waited. Richard seemed normal at first. He spoke about an appointment the following morning. He complained about the weather. He even smiled when Victoria made a small joke. That smile almost broke her. Then his expression changed. Richard stopped speaking. His hand moved toward his chest as his breathing became uneven. Richard. He looked at her. What did you give me? Victoria's heart slammed against her ribs. I don't know what you mean. He tried to stand but stumbled against the table. Within moments, he was violently ill. Victoria stepped backward. For one terrible second, she forgot every part of the role she had rehearsed. Then instinct returned. She grabbed her phone. Help me, she cried. Her voice sounded convincing, even to herself. She called emergency services and described Richard's condition with trembling urgency. She stayed beside him, holding his hand, crying when she thought someone might hear. Inside, however, she was watching his breathing, watching his eyes, waiting for the moment when the man who controlled her future would become nothing more than a memory. The minutes seemed endless. Sirens eventually appeared beyond the rain. Paramedics rushed inside. Asking questions, Victoria answered quickly. She told them Richard had suddenly become sick. She said she had no idea why. They worked around him while Victoria stood against the wall. She looked terrified. She felt almost nothing. Then Richard's eyes opened. For a moment, the noise disappeared. He looked directly at Victoria. Not at the paramedics. Not at the ceiling. Her. His expression was strangely calm. There was no confusion in his eyes. No fear. Only recognition. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Richard's lips moved, but whatever he tried to say was lost beneath the noise of the room. Victoria remembered Daniel's visit, the folder, and Richard's strange warning about documents speaking for themselves. Until that moment, she had believed those words belonged to a divorce. Now, lying beside the dying man, she wondered whether Richard had been preparing for something more frightening. Then his eyes closed. The paramedics continued working. Victoria remained frozen. She had expected death to bring relief. Instead, one question suddenly overwhelmed everything else. What had Richard understood in those final seconds? And why had he looked at her as though he had been expecting this all along? Richard died before sunrise. By then, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Atlanta slick and silver beneath the early morning light. Victoria sat alone in the hospital waiting room, wrapped in a blanket she did not remember receiving. She had cried when the doctors told her there was nothing more they could do. She cried again when a nurse touched her shoulder. To everyone watching, she was a devastated wife, and she played the part perfectly. Police arrived later that morning. They asked questions about Richard's health, his medications, and the events leading to his collapse. Victoria answered carefully, describing his sudden illness and her desperate attempt to save him. No investigator accused her. No one raised a voice. There was simply a clipboard, a series of questions, and the quiet assumption that Richard's death had been a terrible medical event. That assumption gave Victoria a strange sense of safety. As she drove home alone, she expected grief to overwhelm her. Instead, she thought about the estate, the house, the investments, the properties, everything she believed Richard had been preparing to leave behind. She told herself that thinking about money did not make her heartless. Richard had spent years making money the foundation of their lives. If she inherited it, she would simply be receiving what she had been promised by their marriage. At home, she walked through rooms that suddenly felt enormous. Richard's shoes were still beside the door. His coffee cup remained on the kitchen counter. His study was exactly as he had left it. Victoria stood in the doorway and imagined herself finally free. Then she remembered Daniel Brooks. If Richard's estate was worth what she believed, Daniel would know how quickly the legal process could begin. She called him. He answered after the third ring. Victoria. Daniel, I need to know what happens now. There was a pause. To the estate? Yes. Another silence followed. Victoria. There is something you need to understand. Her stomach tightened. What? Richard changed his will yesterday. For several seconds, She heard nothing except the faint hum of the refrigerator behind her. That isn't possible. It is. No, you must be mistaken. I was there. Victoria gripped the phone. You're telling me he changed everything yesterday? I am telling you that he executed new estate documents yesterday. Yesterday. The word struck her with terrifying force. 1 day before Richard had been poisoned. 1 day before he died. Victoria sank into a chair. What does the new will say? I can't discuss the contents with you yet. I'm his wife. I understand. Then tell me. Not until the proper estate process begins. Her voice became sharper. Daniel, I need to know whether I'm still the beneficiary. Daniel remained silent. That silence was worse than an answer. Victoria closed her eyes. The fortune she had imagined inheriting might already belong to someone else. Everything she had done had been based on one assumption. Richard would die and his money would become hers. Now that assumption was collapsing. She suddenly understood the terrible irony. Richard may have taken her out of his will before she ever took him out of her future. When the call ended, Victoria remained motionless. Her grief was gone. So was her certainty. For the first time since Richard's death, she was no longer afraid of being caught. She was afraid she had killed him for nothing. And somewhere inside Richard's newly signed documents was an answer that could destroy her entire life. Victoria turned away from the desk. Fear had replaced reason. If Richard had changed his will so recently, someone else knew why. And Daniel knew exactly who that person might be. She reached for her phone, then stopped. The will might reveal a motive. Her motive. If investigators discovered that motive, they might begin asking questions she could not answer. Not without destroying what remained. The revelation came quietly, almost too quietly for the damage it was about to cause. Victoria sat across from the attorney, staring at the pages of Richard's new will as though refusing to understand what she was seeing. Then the attorney read the terms again. Victoria had been removed as the primary beneficiary. Richard's estate would instead be divided among a charitable foundation, several longtime employees, and a beneficiary whose identity was hidden behind a private trust. For several seconds, Victoria said nothing. Her face remained still, but inside, panic was spreading. She had not killed Richard because she loved him. She had killed him because she believed his death would leave her with everything. The house, the accounts, the investments, the security she thought she had secured for herself. All of it was supposed to become hers. Now she was learning that none of it would. What frightened her most was the timing. The attorney explained that Richard's final financial decisions had been completed only hours before his death. That detail hit Victoria harder than the will itself. Richard had changed his plans at the very last moment, meaning the future she had counted on had disappeared just before she committed the crime. Victoria tried to control her breathing. She asked questions, searching for some mistake in the documents. But there was no mistake. The signatures were valid. The instructions were clear. Richard had deliberately redirected his estate away from her. And somewhere beneath Victoria's shock was an even darker realization. If investigators discovered that she had expected to inherit everything, the new will could become more than a financial disappointment, could become a motive. That was when the investigation began moving in a different direction. Until then, Richard's death had largely been treated as an unfortunate event surrounding a wealthy man whose health had already raised concerns. But new information reached investigators, suggesting that his death might not have been natural after all. The possibility was enough to reopen questions that had previously seemed settled. Detective Sarah Mitchell was assigned to look into those questions. Sarah did not arrive with accusations. She arrived with patience. She reviewed the basic timeline first, then Richard's financial activity, his relationships, and the people who stood to gain or lose from his death. Victoria quickly caught her attention. There was something about Victoria's behavior that did not fit the grieving relative investigators expected to see. She seemed unusually focused on the estate, asking about documents, accounts, and decisions that had little to do with mourning. Sarah noticed how carefully Victoria chose her words, and how quickly her expression changed whenever Richard's final financial decisions were mentioned. Still, Sarah knew suspicion was not evidence. So she went deeper. She examined Victoria's relationship with Richard and began comparing what Victoria had told investigators with information gathered from other sources. She looked at financial motives, recent conversations, and the circumstances surrounding Richard's final hours. Each detail seemed ordinary by itself. Together, however, they created a pattern Sarah could not ignore. Then she requested Richard's medical records. First, nothing seemed unusual. The records showed his medical history, previous concerns, and the treatments he had received. But Sarah compared the documented condition of Richard's health with the circumstances surrounding his death. Something did not match. The timing was wrong. Certain details in the medical records did not fit what investigators had been told about Richard's final moments. Sarah read the relevant entries again, then checked them against the initial death information. She stopped. For the first time, Sarah had something concrete that could challenge the assumption that Richard had died naturally. And if the medical records were telling the truth, then someone had been lying about what happened to Richard. Sarah closed the file, knowing the case had just changed completely. The question was no longer simply who would inherit Richard's fortune. Now Sarah had to determine whether Victoria's motive had existed before the killing, or whether Richard's final decisions had changed everything at the last possible moment. Either possibility pointed toward a secret still waiting to be uncovered. And Sarah intended to find the answer. It was who had wanted him dead and why. The discovery in Richard's medical records gave Detective Sarah Mitchell a reason to keep digging. But it was what she found next that began turning suspicion into something much more serious. If Richard had not died naturally, Sarah needed to understand what had happened during the days leading up to his death. So she stopped looking only at the final hours and began reconstructing Richard's entire final week. She started with his appointments, phone calls, financial activity, and private meetings. Piece by piece, a different picture of Richard began to emerge. He had not simply been preparing his affairs. He had been worried. Several entries suggested that Richard had become increasingly concerned about Victoria. He had asked questions about financial protections, reviewed documents that had previously seemed routine, and made changes that appeared strangely urgent. Sarah noticed that many of those decisions had been made shortly before his death. Then one name appeared repeatedly: Daniel. Sarah learned that Richard had spoken privately with Daniel about protecting the estate. The wording caught her attention immediately. Richard had apparently been preparing for the possibility that someone close to him might attempt to manipulate his finances. That was no longer just an estate matter. Could have been a warning. Sarah arranged an interview with Daniel and began carefully asking about his relationship with Richard. Daniel was cautious. He clearly understood that Richard had trusted him, and at first, he refused to reveal anything that he believed was confidential. Sarah did not pressure him recklessly. Instead, she explained that the circumstances surrounding Richard's death had changed the situation. If Richard had genuinely feared someone close to him, then keeping that information hidden could prevent investigators from understanding what had happened. Daniel remained silent for several moments. Then he finally gave in. He told Sarah that Richard had said something shortly before his death that had stayed with him ever since. Richard had been unusually serious when he said it. According to Daniel, Richard had looked at him and quietly warned, "My wife thinks she knows what I'm going to do. She doesn't." Sarah immediately asked what Richard meant. Daniel could not say for certain. Richard had not explained everything. But the statement suddenly gave new meaning to the changes Sarah had already uncovered. Richard had apparently known that Victoria was expecting something from him. More importantly, he had deliberately kept his plans hidden from her. That changed the investigation completely. Until that moment, investigators had been trying to determine whether Victoria had a motive after Richard's death. Now they had to consider something far more disturbing. Richard may have suspected Victoria before he died. Sarah returned to the timeline and examined every financial decision again. The new will no longer looked like a final administrative choice. It looked potentially deliberate. Richard had changed the direction of his estate, protected certain assets, and apparently concealed his intentions from the person who believed she knew exactly what he planned to do. Meanwhile, Victoria was dealing with a discovery of her own. While searching through Richard's belongings, She found something she had never seen before. A private recording. Her first instinct was to leave it alone. Then curiosity overcame fear. Victoria waited until she was completely alone before opening it. The screen came to life and Richard appeared. He was sitting in a quiet room, speaking directly toward the camera. His expression was serious, almost as if he had been expecting someone to watch the recording after he was gone. Victoria stared at the screen without moving. Richard began speaking. It was not a message about his estate. It was not a farewell. He appeared to be speaking directly to whoever eventually found the recording. Victoria's breathing became shallow as she realized something terrifying. Richard had prepared this message before his death, and whatever he was about to reveal could explain exactly why he had changed everything. The recording continued, and Victoria realized she might finally be hearing the truth Richard had hidden from her. The recording continued, and for Victoria, every second felt like another door closing behind her. Richard looked directly into the camera, calm but visibly tired. He explained that the problems in his marriage had not appeared overnight. For months, he had watched Victoria become increasingly interested in his money, his accounts, and what would happen to his estate if he died. He did not sound angry. That somehow made his words more frightening. Richard said he had begun noticing questions that seemed innocent at first. Victoria wanted to know where certain documents were kept. She asked about investments, insurance policies, and accounts she had rarely mentioned before. Eventually, Richard realized that her interest was no longer simply curiosity. She was planning for a future without him. Richard explained that he had quietly changed his will because he no longer trusted the intentions of the person closest to him. He had redirected his estate and placed protections around several assets, making sure that his final decisions would not be easy to reverse. But then came the part Victoria had been hoping never to hear. Richard did not say that Victoria had killed him. He did not accuse her of plotting murder. Instead, he left investigators a warning. If something happened to him, Richard said, they should examine anyone who suddenly benefited from his death. He wanted them to follow the money, question unexpected beneficiaries, and look carefully at anyone who appeared to gain from his disappearance. Victoria stared at the screen, barely breathing. Richard had not named her. He did not need to. The message made it clear that he had anticipated the possibility of something happening to him. Worse, he had created a trail that could lead investigators directly toward the person who had the strongest financial motive. Victoria stopped the recording. For several moments, she remained completely still. Then panic took over. She began thinking about everything she had touched, everything she had said, and every decision she had made during Richard's final hours. If Sarah found even one piece of evidence connecting her to the death, the recording could make the entire case impossible to explain. Meanwhile, Sarah was uncovering another layer of Richard's preparation. Financial records showed that Richard had deliberately created obstacles around portions of his estate. Certain transfers required additional authorization. Some accounts had unusual safeguards. Several financial instructions appeared designed to delay anyone attempting to access his assets immediately after his death. At first, Sarah wondered whether Richard had simply been cautious. Then she compared the timing. The obstacles had been established shortly before his death. That suggested something much more deliberate. Richard may have been setting a trap. If someone attempted to kill him for financial gain, that person might expect immediate access to his wealth. Instead, Richard had arranged his affairs so that any sudden attempt to claim the money could leave a record. Sarah realized the implications immediately. Richard had potentially built a financial tripwire without telling Victoria exactly what he had done. Now the investigation became a race. Victoria began thinking about evidence that could disappear, conversations that might be forgotten, and objects that could connect her to Richard's final night. Fear was pushing her toward desperate decisions. Sarah was moving in the opposite direction. She was reconstructing every minute of Richard's final hours, comparing statements, records, medical information, financial activity, and physical evidence. Neither woman knew exactly how close the other was, but both understood that time was running out. Victoria needed to erase the past before someone found it. Sarah needed to uncover it before it vanished. Sarah requested surveillance footage, phone records, and access logs covering that window. She suspected the missing hours were not an accident. Someone had entered Richard's world during that period, or made sure investigators could not see what happened there. For Sarah, that missing time was the important part of the case. And as Sarah rebuilt Richard's final timeline, one unexplained gap began standing out more than everything else. There was a missing period of time between Richard's last confirmed activity and the moment his death was discovered. That gap was only a few hours, but those hours could contain the truth. The missing hours gave Sarah Mitchell the opening she had been waiting for. She returned to Victoria's timeline and began comparing every statement against the records, the emergency call, and the evidence recovered from Richard's home. The more Sarah compared, the more Victoria's carefully constructed story began to fall apart. At first, the inconsistencies were small. Victoria said Richard had eaten a light dinner. Later, she described a heavier meal. She initially claimed Richard had complained of feeling weak, but then changed the symptoms she remembered. She also gave different accounts of what happened immediately before emergency responders arrived. Sarah listened without interrupting. Then she asked the same questions again. Victoria noticed. Her confidence began disappearing. She tried explaining the differences as stress. She said the night had been chaotic and that she could not be expected to remember every detail perfectly. But Sarah was not looking for one imperfect memory. She was looking at a pattern. Every time Victoria changed the story, the new version seemed to place her farther away from Richard's final moments. That made Sarah even more suspicious. Victoria's attorney recognized the danger before she did. During a private conversation, he warned her to stop answering questions. He explained that every new statement created another opportunity for investigators to find contradictions. Victoria nodded, but silence was harder than she expected. The pressure inside her finally broke. Instead of continuing to defend her timeline, Victoria began talking about Richard himself. She described years of emotional pressure and claimed that Richard had manipulated her psychologically. According to Victoria, he had controlled the marriage by making her feel financially dependent and constantly reminding her that he could leave her with nothing. She insisted that Richard had threatened her future. She said he had deliberately made her feel powerless. For a moment, Sarah simply listened. There was something uncomfortable about the story because parts of it could have been true. People could suffer emotional cruelty inside relationships without anyone outside knowing. Richard might have been controlling. He might have used money as a weapon. He might have made Victoria feel trapped. But Sarah understood the difference between explaining someone's suffering and proving someone's innocence. Emotional cruelty could explain anger, could explain resentment. It could even explain why someone might desperately want a relationship to end. But it did not automatically explain murder. Sarah returned to the physical evidence. The toxicology results had already established that Richard had been poisoned. Now investigators needed to determine how the substance reached him and who could have placed it there. A final piece of evidence came from the kitchen. Testing revealed traces of the same substance connected to Richard's poisoning on an item that investigators could place directly within Victoria's reach during the relevant period. Sarah examined the report twice. The connection was not based on suspicion or financial motive anymore. It was physical. Victoria had been close to the source of the poisoning. The evidence did not answer every question, but it changed the case dramatically. The pressure was becoming impossible to escape. Every new discovery narrowed the possibilities, while every attempt Victoria made to explain herself created another contradiction. Sarah knew that motive alone could never carry a case this far. She needed to prove opportunity, method, and timing. The missing hours suddenly mattered more than ever to everyone involved. When Victoria learned that investigators had recovered physical evidence connecting her to the poison, something inside her finally broke. She understood that the questions had changed. They were no longer asking whether Richard's death had been natural. They were no longer simply examining his medical history or wondering whether his health had failed. They were asking who had wanted him dead. And Victoria knew exactly what that question meant. The investigation had crossed a line she could no longer undo. Sarah now had motive, contradictions, Richard's warning, financial evidence, and a physical connection to the poisoning. What she still needed was the one thing that could tie everything together: a clear reconstruction of what happened during those missing final hours. That was the timeline Victoria had been trying to control, and now Sarah was determined to take it away from her. The timeline finally became too heavy for Victoria to carry. After everything Sarah had uncovered, there was nowhere left for Victoria to hide. The contradictions, the financial records, Richard's recording, and the physical evidence had closed every escape route she had tried to create. Sarah confronted her quietly. She did not threaten Victoria or raise her voice. She simply placed the evidence in front of her and asked one question after another. Why had she changed her story? Why had she been so focused on Richard's estate? Why had the poison been connected to an item she could access? And why had Richard warned someone to follow the money if he died? Victoria stared at the table. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she finally whispered that she had wanted Richard gone. Sarah asked what she meant. Victoria insisted that she had not planned to kill him. She said she had only wanted the marriage to end. She wanted the control, the humiliation, and the constant fear to stop. She described Richard as a man who knew exactly how to make her feel powerless. But Sarah kept asking about the night Richard died. Eventually, Victoria's carefully guarded story collapsed. She admitted that she had poisoned Richard. The words seemed to shock even Victoria once they were spoken aloud. She explained that she believed his death would solve everything. She believed she would inherit his fortune, escape the life she hated, and finally have control over her own future. In her mind, the money had made the impossible seem possible. Then Sarah told her what Victoria had never understood. Richard had already changed his will. He had removed Victoria as the primary beneficiary before his death. The confession suddenly became something far more tragic and disturbing. Victoria had killed Richard believing she would inherit everything. But by the time she committed the crime, the inheritance she wanted was already gone. For a moment, Victoria looked completely defeated. She began crying as she described the years that had led her to that point. She spoke about resentment that had built slowly, moments when she felt humiliated, arguments that left her feeling trapped, and the fear that Richard could control her entire future simply by controlling his money. She said she had felt manipulated for years. She said she had convinced herself that Richard deserved what happened. But Sarah did not accept that explanation as an excuse. She listened carefully, allowing Victoria to tell the truth about the relationship without allowing that truth to erase the crime. Whatever Richard had done, Victoria had still made a choice. She had poisoned him, and she had believed his death would secure her financial future. Now she had to live with the reality that the plan had achieved the opposite. Sarah understood that the confession explained the motive, but it also raised another question. If Richard had already changed his will, had he known Victoria was capable of harming him? Victoria seemed to be thinking about the same thing. She remembered Richard's private warnings, his hidden recording, and the strange financial protections he had created shortly before his death. Suddenly, all those details felt connected. She looked at Sarah through tearful eyes. Her voice was barely audible when she finally asked the question that had haunted the entire investigation. Did he know? Sarah did not answer immediately. She could not, because although Richard had clearly feared something, there was still no way to know exactly what he understood about Victoria's intentions before the poisoning. Sarah looked down at the evidence, then back at Victoria. The confession had answered who poisoned Richard. But one final mystery remained. Did Richard know the danger was coming, and had he prepared for his own death before Victoria ever made her final decision? That question would lead investigators back to the recording, and to the one detail Richard had deliberately left behind. And if Richard had suspected Victoria, his decisions were not estate planning. They may have been preparations for the moment his fear became reality. Sarah now had to determine whether Richard had been protecting his fortune, protecting himself, or setting a trap for the person he believed would destroy him. The question Sarah could not answer finally led investigators back to Richard's estate plan. If he had suspected danger, There had to be a reason for the strange changes he had made before his death. The final secret was hidden inside the identity of the mysterious beneficiary. When Sarah uncovered the trust records, the name finally appeared. Rebecca, Richard's estranged younger sister. Victoria had been told for years that Rebecca was dead to the family. Their relationship had supposedly ended so completely that Victoria never expected to hear her name again. But Richard had secretly reconnected with Rebecca months before his death. He had not told Victoria. He had not wanted her involved in the decision. And now Sarah understood why. Richard had quietly arranged for Rebecca to receive a significant portion of his fortune through the trust. The discovery changed the meaning of the entire estate plan. Richard had not simply been trying to punish Victoria. He had been making a personal choice about where his wealth should go after he was gone. He wanted to repair a relationship he had once abandoned. He wanted to support people who had stood by him. He wanted his fortune to help others rather than become a source of control inside a broken marriage. The money had never been intended as a weapon against Victoria. It had simply been taken out of her reach. The truth had been sitting in the documents all along, waiting for someone to read beyond the numbers. Richard had tried to protect his legacy and those he trusted. Instead, his decision became the evidence that exposed everything around him. The trial followed, and Victoria's confession became central to the prosecution's case. The evidence showed motive, opportunity, preparation, and finally, her own admission that she had poisoned Richard because she believed his death would make her wealthy. The verdict came after the evidence had been presented and the arguments were finished. Victoria was convicted, but the story could not end with a simple idea of justice being served. Nothing about what happened could be made simple. Richard was dead. Victoria's marriage was destroyed. A family had been shattered. And the fortune that had driven everything ultimately became meaningless to the people who had fought over it. Rebecca inherited what Richard had intended for her, but no amount of money could restore the brother she had only recently found again. The employees and charitable causes he had chosen could benefit from his generosity, but none of those decisions could change the final hours of his life. Even Victoria's victory, the inheritance she had imagined waiting for her, had never existed. Eventually, Sarah returned to the Atlanta house. The mansion was still standing, almost untouched from the outside. The walls remained. The rooms remained. The expensive possessions remained. But Victoria's life inside that house was over. Sarah stood there for a moment, thinking about how differently everything might have unfolded if Victoria had known the truth one day earlier. Richard had changed his will one day before the murder. One day. That was the strange irony at the center of the entire case. Victoria believed Richard's money was worth killing for, yet Richard had already removed that money from her reach before she committed the crime. She killed for an inheritance she had already lost. She destroyed her marriage for a future that no longer existed. And she made an irreversible choice based not on what Richard had actually decided, but on what she feared he might decide. That was the deepest tragedy of all. Victoria did not kill Richard because she knew what was in the will. She killed him because she was afraid of what might be in it. By the time she finally learned the truth, there was nothing left to change. The money could be divided. The estate could be transferred. The house could remain standing. But Richard could not be brought back. And Victoria could never return to the moment before she made that choice. In the end, the will had not destroyed Victoria's life. Fear had. Richard's fortune was never worth a life. But Victoria spent the rest of hers learning that too late.